When Francis Ford Coppola fought tooth and nail to cast Marlon Brando in The Godfather, the studio thought he'd lost his mind. By 1971, Brando wasn't just washed up, he was radioactive. The actor who had once revolutionized Hollywood with a raw, naturalistic energy and a streetcar named Desire, and on the waterfront had become a pariah, infamous for blowing budgets, showing up late, clashing with directors, and worst of all, phoning in performances that made him look bored with acting itself. Paramount executives saw a liability, but Coppola saw the man who could breathe soul into Don Vito Corleone, the aging patriarch of a crime family torn between tradition and change. What the executives couldn't see was that Brando's eccentricities, including his now legendary refusal to memorize lines, were not laziness, but part of a deeply held philosophy about what it meant to act. And it was this philosophy that made his Godfather performance unforgettable. Brando's career had always been built on rebellion. In the 1940s, Hollywood actors were stiff, polished, and trained to recite dialogue as if they were delivering Shakespeare in a theater.
Shall I wait for that goddamn truck to go by?
Brando came out of the actor's studio in New York, a disciple of the Stanislavski method, which emphasized living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. He refused to declaim lines. He wanted to be. In A Streetcar Named Desire, his portrayal of Stanley Kowalski was so explosive, so raw, that audiences and critics alike felt they weren't watching a play but eavesdropping on reality. When he won his first Oscar for On the Waterfront in 1954, the industry knew acting had changed forever. Here was a man who could grunt, mumble, and stumble his way through dialogue and somehow make it feel like scripture. But Brando's commitment to naturalism soon morphed into a war against artifice of any kind. He hated the way rehearsed lines sounded. To him, actors who memorized dialogue came across like schoolchildren reciting "Mary Had a Little Lamb," words said by rote, lifeless, lacking the messiness of thought. In his own words, in ordinary life, people seldom know exactly what they're going to say when they open their mouths. They pause, they search, they grope for words. That grope for words, that hesitation, was the essence of reality, and Brando would do anything to capture it on screen. If that meant refusing to memorize lines, so be it. By the time Coppola approached him for The Godfather, Brando had perfected his system, cue cards, or as the industry cruelly nicknamed them, idiot cards. These were lines scrawled on paper and taped to walls, props, even hidden in other actors' clothing so Brando could glance at them without breaking the illusion. To outsiders, it seemed like sheer laziness, the indulgence of a star too arrogant to do the basic homework of acting. But Brando argued that these cards liberated him. By not knowing what words were coming until the moment he read them, he could react as though they were freshly conceived thoughts. His pauses, his broken sentences, the searching look in his eyes, all of it came from the fact that he was genuinely searching. On the set of The Godfather, this technique horrified some and enchanted others. Coppola, always teetering between fear of disaster and flashes of genius, worried Brando would set a dangerous precedent. If the greatest actor alive didn't memorize his lines, what was to stop Al Pacino, James Caan, or Robert Duvall from doing the same? Yet Brando's results silenced doubts. Watch him in the film's opening scene, where Don Corleone listens to Bonacera's plea for justice on the day of his daughter's wedding. Brando doesn't deliver lines like an actor performing dialogue. He responds. His voice, gravelly and deliberate, drags through pauses that feel like he's weighing every word in real time. His hand absently strokes a cat, his eyes flicker with thought, and every phrase lands like a verdict. That was the power of Brando's method. He turned written dialogue into lived experience. There's another layer to this story though, one that makes it richer and more complicated than the myth of a lazy genius. Brando's refusal to memorize lines wasn't always rooted in artistic purity. By the late 1960s, his reputation for being difficult had as much to do with boredom as with philosophy. He found acting repetitive, Hollywood corrupt, and scripts uninspiring. Cue cards in some cases allowed him to disengage. On certain sets, he barely read scripts beforehand, preferring to discover them on the spot. Directors complained that his improvisations derailed scenes. Crews grumbled that his antics wasted time and money. Even Coppola, who adored Brando's brilliance, admitted that working with him was like wrestling a tornado. Unpredictable, sometimes destructive, but undeniably awe-inspiring when it worked. What's fascinating is how Brando's supposed laziness dovetailed perfectly with the role of Don Corleone. The Godfather is a man who speaks little, considers everything, and uses silence as a weapon. His power comes not from bluster, but from restraint. Brando's halting, card-fed delivery gave the illusion of a man calculating each syllable, weighing life and death with every pause. Would a memorized, polished recitation have carried the same menace? Probably not. In that sense, Brando's refusal to memorize wasn't just a quirk, it was alchemy, transforming potential weakness into transcendent strength. And yet, the irony of Brando's Godfather performance is that while it cemented his legacy, it also fed the caricature of him as a diva. Stories of his cue cards became Hollywood legend, repeated with equal parts amusement and contempt. Other actors, especially those who prided themselves on discipline, dismissed him as lazy, but younger performers saw something else. Freedom. If Brando could throw away the script and still create one of the greatest performances in film history, maybe acting wasn't about rigid adherence, but about truth. Al Pacino later admitted that working opposite Brando was like attending a masterclass. Even if he didn't adopt the cue card method, he absorbed Brando's insistence that acting should always feel alive. The deeper twist here is that Brando's war against memorization was really a war against Hollywood itself. He despised the industry's obsession with image and polish, the way it flattened complexity into predictable formulas. By refusing to play along, by stumbling, pausing, forgetting, and rediscovering lines on camera, he reminded audiences that life itself is messy. In his own strange way, he was smuggling authenticity into an industry built on fakery. That's why, even when his methods infuriated directors, the results often spoke for themselves. Consider how different this could have turned out. If Brando had memorized every line, polished every phrase, and delivered Don Corleone with theatrical precision, the character might have become cartoonish, a gangster stereotype instead of a mythic patriarch. Instead, his unpredictability made the Don feel eerily real, as though he were thinking, scheming, and shifting in front of our eyes. Brando turned the weakness of memory into the strength of presence. Of course, the story doesn't end with The Godfather. Brando's reliance on cue cards grew more notorious in later years, reaching almost absurd extremes. On the set of Superman, 1978, he demanded lines be written on baby Superman's diaper so he could read them while holding the infant. On Apocalypse Now, 1979, he arrived overweight, unprepared, and again refused to memorize anything. Coppola, desperate, let Brando improvise entire monologues in shadow, creating the haunting, incoherent ramblings of Colonel Kurtz. Critics were divided. Was it genius or indulgence? Maybe both, but no one could deny that Brando, even at his most chaotic, remained magnetic. What makes Brando's Godfather story so enduring is the paradox at its core. Here was an actor accused of laziness, yet his supposed laziness birthed one of cinema's greatest performances. Here was a man mocked for needing idiot cards, yet he used them to craft a portrayal so layered it still anchors acting classes half a century later. Here was a performer who claimed he wasn't even trying, and in not trying, he achieved what others rehearsed a lifetime to reach. The larger question lingers: was Brando a genius who disguised his brilliance as sloppiness, or a lazy man whose natural gifts accidentally produced greatness? The answer, maddeningly, is probably both. Brando was a contradiction, a man who cared deeply about truth but cared little for discipline, who could elevate a scene to immortality or sink it into chaos depending on his mood. In The Godfather, those contradictions aligned, and cinema was changed forever. And maybe that's the real legacy of his cue cards. They weren't just memory aids, they were a statement, a rebellion, a reminder that art doesn't have to follow rules to touch eternity. In refusing to memorize his lines, Brando memorized himself into history.